What if everything you thought you knew about Hollywood was a lie? Behind the glitz and glamour lies a world of power, fear, and manipulation, where a single phone call could make or break a career. Let's uncover the shocking truth of how one man's empire of abuse went unchallenged for decades. From chilling threats to manipulative cover-ups, this is the story they didn't want you to hear. Get ready to dive into the dark underbelly of Tinseltown. Are you ready for the truth? Chapter 1. The Predator in Hollywood Shadows. The suite was lavish, pristine white furniture, a stocked bar, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering skyline. But to her, it felt like a cage. The young actress stood frozen, her breath shallow, her pulse hammering in her ears. Harvey Weinstein loomed between her and the door, his bulk filling the space. His voice was calm, almost soothing, but beneath it lurked something far more menacing. "You'll never work in this town if you don't play the game," he murmured, stepping closer. She had heard the whispers, the warnings passed in hushed tones at industry parties. Don't go to his hotel room alone. But how could she say no? He was the kingmaker of Hollywood, the man who held the keys to stardom. And now she was trapped. Weinstein's ascent was the stuff of legend. Alongside his brother Bob, he co-founded Miramax in 1979, named after their parents, Miriam and Max. The company began by distributing independent films, but it was in the 90s that Weinstein transformed it into a Hollywood powerhouse. Miramax became synonymous with prestige cinema, pulp fiction, Shakespeare in Love, Good Will Hunting. With an uncanny ability to spot Oscar contenders, Weinstein was the puppet master behind many golden statuettes. Power in Hollywood wasn't just about money. It was about control. Weinstein had both. He had the ear of directors, producers, and studio executives. He could launch careers or end them with a single call. And everyone knew it. But behind the red carpets and acceptance speeches, there was another side to Harvey Weinstein, a side that thrived in the shadows. A predator, shielded by power, protected by silence. Gwyneth Paltrow was 22 years old when Weinstein cast her in Emma, a pivotal moment in her budding career. It wasn't long before she received the dreaded invitation, a private meeting at his suite at the Peninsula Beverly Hills Hotel. At first, the meeting seemed normal, businesslike, but then Weinstein suggested a massage. The shift was sudden, the air thick with something unspoken. Paltrow, uneasy, excused herself and fled. When she confided in her then-boyfriend, Brad Pitt, he was furious. Unlike many in Hollywood who turn a blind eye, Pitt confronted Weinstein at a Broadway opening, shoving him against a wall. "If you ever make her feel uncomfortable again, I'll fucking kill you," he warned. Weinstein was livid. Days later, Paltrow received a call. His voice was cold, threatening. He berated her for speaking out, for making waves. She was one of the lucky ones. She escaped, but others weren't so fortunate. For years, Weinstein's predatory behavior was an open secret. Whispers of hotel rooms, unwanted advances, and silenced women. But breaking the silence came at a price. Zelda Perkins, a young assistant at Miramax, learned this firsthand. She worked closely with Weinstein and witnessed his harassment of multiple women. One night, after a particularly disturbing incident involving a colleague, she decided to act. She confronted Weinstein's lawyers, demanding accountability. The result? A strict non-disclosure agreement. A payoff. Silence. She was forced to walk away, carrying the weight of what she had seen, knowing that speaking out could mean the end of her career. Then there was Laura Madden, an early victim who experienced Weinstein's pattern of manipulation, coercion, and abuse firsthand. He had a method: lure them in with promises, corner them in private, then unleash his demands. If they resisted, he turned to intimidation. For years, the cycle continued. The women who spoke out were dismissed, branded as troublemakers, buried under NDAs and legal threats. And Weinstein continued his reign, unchecked, protected by an industry that valued profit over people. Hollywood is built on illusions, and the illusion that Weinstein was untouchable was carefully cultivated. His power wasn't just in his influence, it was in the fear he instilled. Agents warned their young actresses, "Be careful around Harvey." Directors and producers whispered the same warnings. But few dared to confront him directly. Too much was at stake. Careers, deals, futures. Some fought back, but the price was exile. For every Gwyneth Paltrow who had Brad Pitt in her corner, there were countless others who had no one. They were left to navigate a system that protected their abuser, a machine that had been designed to ensure that Harvey Weinstein's reign continued, unchallenged. But the whispers were growing louder. The walls of silence were beginning to crack, and soon they would shatter. Chapter 2: The Enforcers. Spies, lawyers, and threats. Harvey Weinstein had built more than just an empire of movies. He had constructed an ironclad fortress of intimidation. His true genius wasn't just in producing award-winning films. It was in silencing the women who dared to defy him. For every victim who gathered the courage to speak up, there was a ruthless machine ready to crush them. Lawyers, PR specialists, private investigators, and spies. Weinstein's reach extended far beyond Hollywood. His wealth bought him influence in courtrooms, newsrooms, and even intelligence agencies. He didn't just defend himself, he went on the attack. His mission wasn't just to win, it was to destroy anyone who could pose a threat. Lisa Bloom had built her career as a fierce defender of women's rights. The daughter of high-profile attorney Gloria Allred, she was known for representing victims of sexual harassment and abuse. She had publicly condemned men like Bill O'Reilly and Donald Trump. She was a self-proclaimed warrior for justice. And yet, behind the scenes, she was plotting to discredit the very women she had built her career protecting. When allegations against Weinstein began surfacing, Bloom sided with the predator, not the victims. She secretly joined Weinstein's legal team, crafting a sinister plan to smear, shame, and silence his accusers. One of her key targets? Rose McGowan. McGowan had long been one of Weinstein's most vocal critics. She had accused him of raping her in 1997 and had never backed down, despite Hollywood's attempts to blacklist her. But Weinstein, with Bloom's help, had a strategy. Bloom's plan was chilling in its precision. She suggested portraying McGowan as crazy, unstable, and unreliable. In one leaked email to Weinstein, she outlined how they could publicly manipulate McGowan's image. She's a proven liar, and we can expose that. She's acting out because she's unhinged. We can place articles questioning her credibility. Bloom even offered to personally go on television to discredit McGowan and spin the narrative in Weinstein's favor. A feminist lawyer, the kind women had trusted to protect them, was now actively working to destroy them. For Weinstein, silencing victims wasn't enough. He needed to know what they knew, who they were talking to, and what they were planning. So he hired Black Cube, an elite Israeli intelligence firm staffed with former Mossad operatives. Their specialty? Infiltration, surveillance, deception. The mission was clear: track down Weinstein's enemies, get close to them, gain their trust, and then report back. One of the most sinister operations was the Diana Phillip operation, a real-life espionage mission straight out of a spy thriller. Rose McGowan had been working on a memoir that detailed Weinstein's predatory behavior. If published, it would be devastating. Weinstein knew he had to stop it. Enter Diana Phillip. She introduced herself as a women's rights advocate working for a powerful investment firm that supported female empowerment. She told McGowan she admired her work. She took her to fancy dinners, flattered her, offered to help fund her projects. All the while, she was secretly recording their conversations. Every word McGowan spoke, every plan she discussed about exposing Weinstein, it was all being reported directly back to Black Cube. But Diana Phillip wasn't real. Her real name was Stella Penn-Pekenak, a former Israeli intelligence agent hired by Weinstein to pose as a feminist to infiltrate McGowan's world. McGowan would later recall feeling uneasy, sensing something wasn't quite right. But by the time the truth came out, the damage had been done. Weinstein didn't just worry about his victims. He feared anyone who could expose him. So he made a list he called the kill list. 91 names. Actresses, journalists, assistants, producers, directors. Anyone he suspected might be talking. Anyone who could pose a threat. The names included some of Hollywood's biggest stars: Rose McGowan, Ashley Judd, Annabelle Ashura, Lupita Nyong'o, Salma Hayek. Journalists like Ronan Farrow and Jodi Kantor, who were digging into his past, were also on the list. He had them followed. Their emails were hacked. Their movements were monitored. Weinstein was hunting them down before they could take him down. In 2015, Weinstein made a mistake. He targeted the wrong woman, one who refused to back down. Amber Badalona Gutierrez was a 22-year-old Italian model. She had moved to New York to pursue her career when she was invited to a meeting with Weinstein at his office. It played out like so many of his other encounters. The compliments, the sudden shift in tone, the hands where they shouldn't be. But Gutierrez fought back. She fled and immediately went to the police. She did something few women before her had dared to do. She reported Weinstein. And then she did something even riskier. She agreed to wear a wire. The next night, she met Weinstein at a hotel bar, an NYPD recording device hidden on her body. The tape would become infamous. Amber Gutierrez, yesterday, you touched my breast. Weinstein, agitated. Oh, please, I'm sorry. Just come in. Gutierrez, why yesterday you touched my breast? Weinstein, I won't do it again. He was caught, admitting it, recorded. There was no doubt. And yet, nothing happened. Weinstein's legal team went into overdrive. His lawyers pressured the NYPD. His PR team went after Gutierrez. Suddenly, tabloids were running stories about her past, painting her as an opportunist, a liar. Within days, the case fell apart. The DA's office declined to prosecute. Weinstein walked free again. For decades, Harvey Weinstein had been untouchable. His lawyers killed stories before they ran. His spies infiltrated the lives of his victims. His threats kept women silent. But something was changing. More women were coming forward. More journalists were investigating. The fortress of intimidation was beginning to weaken. Weinstein didn't know it yet, but his time was running out. And soon the walls would come crashing down. Chapter 3, Hollywood Silence. A culture of fear. Hollywood thrives on secrets, whispers, and power plays. A place where success isn't just about talent, but about knowing the right people, obeying the unwritten rules, and above all, never crossing the wrong person. And in the late 90s and early 2000s, Harvey Weinstein was the wrong person to cross. For decades, his behavior wasn't just suspected, it was an open secret. Agents warned their young female clients about being alone with him. Directors heard the stories. Producers, publicists, and journalists all knew. Some, like Brad Pitt, confronted him. Others, like Quentin Tarantino, later admitted they had heard the rumors and chose to look the other way. Actresses new to Hollywood were often warned in hushed voices. Be careful around Harvey. Don't meet him alone. If he invites you to his hotel, say you're sick. Yet, despite all the warning signs, no one dared to challenge him. Not publicly. Not in a way that could stop him, because speaking out meant risking your career. Ashley Judd was one of the first to reject Weinstein's advances, and one of the first to suffer the consequences. In the late 1990s, she was a rising star, fresh off movies like Heat and A Time to Kill. When Weinstein invited her to his hotel room under the pretense of a meeting, she knew something was off. Then came the now all too familiar routine, a request for a massage, an offer to watch him shower. She refused, made an excuse, and left. What happened next was a lesson in power and retaliation. Suddenly, Judd found herself losing roles. Projects she had been considered for evaporated. Filmmakers who once pursued her were no longer interested. Her career stalled, and no one could tell her why. Years later, Peter Jackson, director of The Lord of the Rings, confirmed what she had long suspected. While casting the films in the early 2000s, he had been eager to bring Judd on board. But when he mentioned her name, Weinstein personally intervened. She's a nightmare to work with, Weinstein told him. A diva. Impossible. You don't want to deal with her. That was all it took. Judd was quietly erased from consideration. Her story wasn't unique. Weinstein used the same tactics to silence dozens of women. The message was clear: reject me, and I will end you. In 2004, a journalist named Sharon Waxman was working on an expose about Weinstein's abuse for the New York Times. She had uncovered disturbing details, including financial settlements with victims and first-hand accounts from women he had harassed. But before the piece could be published, powerful forces intervened. According to Waxman, Matt Damon and Russell Crowe personally called her to vouch for Weinstein, telling her that the allegations were false, exaggerated, or simply misunderstandings. Then Weinstein's army of lawyers and PR specialists descended on the New York Times, pressuring the editors. The story was killed before it ever saw the light of day. Years later, as the MeToo movement exploded, Damon would deny knowing the full extent of Weinstein's abuse. "I never thought he was a predator," he said in an interview, "but I knew he was an asshole." For the women who suffered at Weinstein's hands, that distinction didn't mean much. The truth about Weinstein wasn't just Hollywood's worst-kept secret, it was a joke. On Oscar night in 2013, comedian Seth MacFarlane was announcing the nominees for Best Supporting Actress. After reading the names, he smirked and said, "Congratulations, you 5 ladies no longer have to pretend to be attracted to Harvey Weinstein." The audience laughed. The joke wasn't controversial. It wasn't shocking. It was met with knowing chuckles, because everyone in the room already knew. But instead of prompting outrage, the moment passed. Weinstein was still too powerful. No one wanted to risk being the first to openly call him out. Few stories illustrate Weinstein's sadistic control over women's careers like Salma Hayek's experience while filming Frida. For Hayek, Frida was more than just a movie. It was a passion project, a film she had fought to make for years. She had poured her heart into it, securing funding, rewriting the script, and preparing for the most demanding role of her career. And then Weinstein stepped in. Suddenly the rules changed. "You wanted more? I will kill your movie," he told her, unless she agreed to his demands. Among them, a graphic nude scene between Hayek and another woman. Complete creative control over the film's final cut. The right to pull the plug at any time. She resisted. She begged. She tried to fight back. But Weinstein controlled everything. He threatened to blacklist her, destroy her career, erase her from Hollywood. So she did what so many other women before her had done. She complied. On the day of the forced sex scene, Hayek had a breakdown. "I was shaking," she later recalled. "I was crying between takes. I felt sick, but I did it because I knew if I didn't, the movie would never see the light of day." The film was released, won critical acclaim, and earned Hayek an Oscar nomination. But behind the success was a woman who had been broken. For years, Hollywood's silence protected Weinstein. Women like Ashley Judd, Mira Sorvino, and Rosanna Arquette were blacklisted for refusing him. Journalists had stories shut down before they could be published. Men in power either ignored the rumors or actively helped suppress them. It took decades before the dam finally broke. When it did, the reckoning was swift. But the question remained, why did it take so long? The answer was simple: Weinstein wasn't just a predator. He was a king, and in Hollywood, no one wanted to risk toppling the throne. Chapter 4. The journalists who wouldn't back down. For decades, Harvey Weinstein was untouchable. Hollywood protected him. His lawyers buried his crimes. His power ensured that even when whispers turned into screams, no one dared to publish the truth. Until a handful of journalists refused to back down. It started as a trickle, rumors, quiet conversations, dead-end leads. Journalists had tried before, but Weinstein always won. He used his wealth to silence victims with ironclad NDAs. He manipulated media executives, made phone calls that killed stories, and smeared any woman who dared to speak out. But in 2017, the tide shifted. 2 separate teams, one at the New York Times, the other at the New Yorker, began digging into Weinstein's past. They wouldn't stop until the world knew the truth. Ronan Farrow had spent years building his reputation as an investigative journalist. He had reported on everything from government corruption to corporate abuses, but nothing compared to what he uncovered about Weinstein. It began with whispers. Actresses, former employees, industry insiders. Many were terrified, but some were willing to talk. Then he found Ambra Battilana Gutierrez. In 2015, the Italian model had gone to the NYPD after Weinstein groped her during a meeting. The police, in a rare moment of action, had her wear a wire. In the recording, Weinstein confesses to assaulting her. "I'm used to that. Come on," Weinstein says coldly. It was damning evidence, but somehow the case was dropped. Weinstein's lawyers went to work, and Gutierrez was painted as a liar, an opportunist. Farrow knew then this story was bigger than anyone realized. But when he brought his findings to NBC News, expecting a green light to publish, he was met with resistance. Executives hesitated. Producers grew nervous. Phone calls were made. And suddenly, NBC wanted nothing to do with the story. Farrow pushed back, but it was clear. Someone high up had decided Weinstein was off limits. He was told to drop it. He didn't. The deeper Farrow dug, the more dangerous things became. He started noticing strangers watching him. His sources were getting nervous, suddenly unwilling to go on record. Then he found out why. Black Cube, the Israeli intelligence firm, was running a spying and threatening operation. A Black Cube agent infiltrated the New Yorker, trying to track Farrow's investigation from the inside. This wasn't just PR damage control. This was an all-out covert operation to destroy the story before it could see daylight. While Farrow was battling spies and corporate sabotage, two other journalists were closing in. Megan Twohey and Jodi Kantor, reporters of the New York Times, had also begun chasing the Weinstein story. They had heard fragments of the truth before, actresses warning each other in hushed tones, employees speaking of NDAs, settlements that never made the news. But now, for the first time, they had proof. They uncovered legal settlements dating back decades, money Weinstein had quietly paid to keep women silent. They spoke to Ashley Judd, who confirmed that Weinstein had sexually harassed her in a hotel room. Then, the breakthrough, Rose McGowan and other survivors agreed to go on record. On October 5, 2017, the New York Times published their bombshell report. Harvey Weinstein had spent decades preying on women, silencing victims, and using his power to cover it all up. Hollywood's biggest secret was now front-page news. Within hours, the world erupted. Actresses who had stayed silent for years came forward one by one. Gwyneth Paltrow, Angelina Jolie, and dozens of others. Social media exploded with the hashtag MeToo. For the first time in his life, Weinstein couldn't stop the flood, and he was furious. His lawyers tried to discredit the victims. His PR team scrambled to spin the narrative. He was a dinosaur, a man of an older era who had made mistakes. But no one was buying it. Days later, the New Yorker published Ronan Farrow's own exposé. He had unearthed even more chilling details, including allegations of rape. The walls were closing in. With his empire collapsing, Weinstein lashed out. His lawyers threatened lawsuits against the New York Times and the New Yorker. Black Cube operatives tried to intimidate sources. Weinstein personally called journalists, demanding they retract their stories. But it was too late. On October 8, 2017, Weinstein was fired from his own company. Days later, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences expelled him. For a man who had once ruled Hollywood, it was the ultimate disgrace. Chapter 5: The Fall. Accusers speak out. Harvey Weinstein wasn't just a serial harasser. He was a predator. For decades, Hollywood's biggest secret had been kept in the shadows. Now, the floodgates were open, and the first women to step forward, they weren't going to whisper. They were going to roar. The MeToo movement, originally coined by activist Turnout Burke, exploded overnight. Rose McGowan, Ashley Judd, Angelina Jolie, Mira Sorvino, Gwyneth Paltrow, Salma Hayek. Dozens of women, some of Hollywood's biggest names, came forward, their voices breaking the silence that had protected Weinstein for so long. Within days, thousands of women across industries, across countries, across social classes used the hashtag MeToo to share their own stories of harassment and abuse. Harvey Weinstein was no longer just a disgraced mogul. He had become the symbol of a broken system, and his accusers weren't done yet. If there was one woman who had fought to bring Weinstein down for years, it was Rose McGowan. McGowan, known for her roles in Scream and Charmed, had long hinted at a dark truth hidden in Hollywood. She had been one of Weinstein's early victims. In 1997, at just 23 years old, McGowan had attended the Sundance Film Festival, where Weinstein invited her to his hotel room for a meeting. She never spoke in detail about what happened, but later, reports revealed that Weinstein sexually assaulted her. At the time, she received a $100,000 settlement, but there was no admission of guilt, and the industry turned a blind eye. For years, She had tried to speak out, but no one listened. Now, with the world finally paying attention, McGowan unleashed her fury. She called Weinstein a monster. She accused Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos of ignoring her warnings. She exposed Lisa Bloom, the so-called feminist lawyer who secretly worked for Weinstein to smear her name. McGowan was relentless, and Hollywood couldn't silence her anymore. When Angelina Jolie stepped forward, it was another devastating blow for Weinstein. The world knew her as an Oscar-winning actress, a humanitarian, one of the most powerful women in Hollywood. But in 2017, she revealed that she, too, had once been a young actress cornered by Weinstein. She had a bad experience with him in the late 1990s while working on Playing by Heart. Weinstein made unwanted advances, and she rejected him. After that, she vowed never to work with him again. More importantly, she warned others. "I told other women about it," Jolie said, "because I never wanted them to go through the same thing." This was crucial. Hollywood had always pretended Weinstein's abuse was a secret, but in reality, actresses had been warning each other for years. Yet somehow, Weinstein had continued his reign. Jolie's revelation added weight to the accusations. If one of Hollywood's most influential women had been targeted, how many others had suffered in silence? In the 1990s, Mira Sorvino was a rising star. She had just won an Oscar for Mighty Aphrodite. She was talented, beautiful, and in demand. And then her career vanished. Years later, the reason became clear. Harvey Weinstein had blacklisted her. Sorvino had rejected Weinstein's advances in the mid-90s. He had invited her to a hotel room. She refused to let him touch her. Not long after, she found herself mysteriously shut out of major projects. Directors who had once wanted to work with her suddenly stopped calling. For years, Uma Thurman had stayed silent. She had worked with Weinstein on some of his biggest films, most notably Kill Bill. But behind the scenes, he had bullied her, manipulated her, and tried to control her. And when she resisted, he tried to destroy her career. It took her months after the MeToo movement began before she finally spoke out. And when she did, she made sure the world felt her rage. "I am not a child, and I have learned that when I've spoken in anger, I usually regret the way I express myself. But I am angry." She revealed how Weinstein had tried to force himself on her in a hotel room. How he had sent threatening messages when she rejected him. How he had intimidated her for years. And how, during the filming of Kill Bill, he had allowed director Quentin Tarantino to put her in life-threatening danger, forcing her to perform a dangerous stunt that led to a permanent spinal injury. For years, Thurman had stayed silent, afraid of what speaking out might cost her. But now the tables had turned. Weinstein was the one cornered, and she was no longer afraid. Each accusation was another nail in Weinstein's coffin. Actresses weren't just coming forward. They were proving that Weinstein had wielded his power like a weapon, destroying careers, silencing women, and getting away with it for decades. And finally, Hollywood was forced to confront its complicity. More women spoke out. More men were exposed. More institutions were questioned. And in 2018, Weinstein was arrested, charged with multiple counts of rape and sexual assault. He went from one of the most powerful men in Hollywood to a disgraced criminal. Chapter 6. The Trial. Weinstein's Empire Crumbles. On May 25, 2018, Harvey Weinstein walked into a New York police station flanked by lawyers. Just a year earlier, he had been one of the most feared men in Hollywood, a kingmaker who decided which actors would rise and which would disappear. Now he was just another criminal facing justice. Outside, a swarm of reporters and cameras surrounded the station. Protesters held signs with "Me Too" scrawled across them. Then, the moment that sent shockwaves through Hollywood, Weinstein was let out in handcuffs. The man who had silenced victims for decades with threats, NDAs, and powerful lawyers was now powerless. As he shuffled forward, his face a mask of humiliation, the world knew the predator had finally been caught. Weinstein was charged with multiple counts of sexual assault, including rape, but he was far from ready to surrender. He had money, he had lawyers, and he had a defense strategy: make it all look consensual. His high-powered legal team, led by Donna Rotuno, tried to paint him as a victim. According to them, Weinstein wasn't a predator. He was a flawed but misunderstood man who had consensual relationships with these women. The defense would argue that his accusers willingly spent time with him after the alleged incidents. Some had maintained contact, even sending friendly emails. There was no evidence of force, only regret. It was a bold and ruthless strategy, aimed at discrediting victims who had already suffered for years. But this time, Weinstein's power couldn't protect him. Early in the trial, the prosecution played a chilling piece of evidence. It was the secret recording made by Ambra Badalona Gutierrez. The recording had been made the next day, as part of a police sting. Gutierrez had worn a wire, confronting Weinstein as he tried to lure her into his hotel room again. And then, his own voice betrayed him. "I'm used to that. Just come in. Don't ruin your friendship with me for 5 minutes. Don't embarrass me in the hotel. I'm a famous guy." In just a few sentences, Weinstein destroyed his own defense. This wasn't a man engaging in consensual relationships. This was a man who expected submission. And the jury heard it all. One by one, Weinstein's accusers took the stand. These were not anonymous victims. They were actresses, assistants, women who had spent years in silence, afraid of what would happen if they spoke. Now, they had their moment. Jessica Mann, an aspiring actress, gave one of the most emotional testimonies of the trial. She recounted in graphic and harrowing detail how Weinstein had raped her in a New York hotel room. She described his physical power, the way he overpowered her, the fear that paralyzed her. And then, something even more chilling, she revealed how Weinstein continued to control her long after that night. How she had stayed in contact with him, fearing that he could ruin her career if she cut him off. How she had pretended everything was fine, just to survive. Weinstein's lawyers pounced on this. They argued that if Mann had willingly stayed in touch, then the encounter couldn't have been rape. But the prosecution flipped the argument against Weinstein. They showed how he used power and fear, not force alone, to trap his victims. And the jury believed her. Mimi Haley, a former Miramax production assistant, delivered another crushing blow. She described how Weinstein had forced himself on her in his Soho apartment in 2006, how she had repeatedly said no, how he had ignored her, overpowering her, violating her. She recalled the smell of his breath, the weight of his body, the moment she realized there was no escape. She broke down in tears on the stand, and as she spoke, Weinstein sat motionless, staring ahead, his empire crumbling with every word. After 5 weeks of testimony, after painful stories and damning evidence, the jury reached a verdict. Harvey Weinstein was found guilty of rape and sexual assault. He was acquitted on the most serious charge, predatory sexual assault, which could have put him in prison for life. But the guilty verdicts were enough. The world watched as Hollywood's most powerful predator was now nothing more than a convicted rapist. The sentencing hearing was packed. Survivors sat in the courtroom, waiting for the final moment of justice. When Weinstein entered in a wheelchair, he looked weak, frail, almost unrecognizable. For decades, he had ruled Hollywood with an iron fist. Now he was just another inmate. Then, the judge delivered his sentence. 23 years in prison. A collective gasp filled the room. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. This was a real, crushing punishment. Weinstein begged for mercy. "I may never see my children again," he pleaded. But the judge was unmoved. The victims, the public, and the entire industry had waited decades for this moment. And now, justice had been served. With Weinstein behind bars, his empire collapsed. The Weinstein Company, once a Hollywood powerhouse, filed for bankruptcy. Dozens of victims sued, and a $19 million settlement was reached. Harvey Weinstein, once the most powerful man in entertainment, was now just another inmate, counting the years until his prison cell door would open, if it ever did. His victims had won. Justice had prevailed. Chapter 7. The Dominoes Fall. Hollywood's other monsters exposed. The air in Hollywood was thick with tension. For decades, the powerful had operated under the protection of a well-oiled machine that crushed any hint of scandal. But now, with Harvey Weinstein in handcuffs, everything was changing. It was as if the very foundation of the entertainment world was starting to crumble. In hushed tones, over private calls and whispered meetings, agents and executives realized the moment of reckoning had arrived, and there was no turning back. Weinstein's fall had emboldened other victims to come forward, and they weren't just targeting him. Hollywood's other monsters were being exposed one by one. The first domino to fall after Weinstein was Kevin Spacey. For years, rumors had swirled about his predatory behavior. The actor who had once won Oscars and accolades for roles in American Beauty and House of Cards was hiding a dark secret. The accusations against him began with Anthony Rapp, the Broadway star who bravely stepped forward in 2017, accusing Spacey of making an unwanted sexual advance when Rapp was just 14 years old. The floodgates opened as other victims came forward, recounting similar tales of harassment, manipulation, and abuse. But Spacey's response to Rapp's accusation was nothing short of bizarre. He didn't express remorse, nor did he try to defend himself with any coherent explanation. Instead, he issued a public apology that barely acknowledged the accusation, followed by a coming-out statement that seemed more like an attempt to deflect attention. "I have chosen now to live as a gay man," he declared, which instantly backfired. The statement felt hollow, calculated, a way to divert attention from the actual crime he was being accused of. The public didn't buy it. They weren't interested in his sexuality. They were interested in the truth behind his actions. Within days, the weight of the allegations became too much. Netflix severed ties with Spacey, effectively ending his career in one fell swoop. House of Cards was left in disarray, and Spacey's once untouchable status crumbled into a pile of shame. The fall of Matt Lauer, the charming and seemingly impeccable anchor of NBC's Today Show, shocked the world. For years, he had been the face of morning television, trusted, admired, and beloved by millions. But beneath the polished veneer, a much darker story was unfolding. Lauer had long been a serial predator, using his position to exploit young female staffers. He had a secret button under his desk, one that allowed him to lock his office door from the inside. It was a trap. Once a woman entered his office, the door could be locked without her knowing, effectively imprisoning her as he exerted his power. The hashtag MeToo movement had given voice to women who had suffered in silence for years. And now, some of Lauer's former colleagues were coming forward, revealing the culture of fear that NBC had cultivated. Women who had tried to speak up were either reassigned, silenced, or quietly paid off to disappear. Lauer's pattern of abuse was not an isolated case. It was part of a system that protected powerful men at all costs. But as the tide of public outrage rose, Lauer's carefully crafted image of the good guy fell apart. In 2017, NBC finally fired him, and the long-hidden truth about his predatory behavior became undeniable. The television titan, who had once been the golden boy of morning television, was now a pariah, his name forever associated with manipulation and betrayal. Hollywood's predators didn't stop at the screen. The allegations surrounding Bryan Singer, the acclaimed director of X-Men and Bohemian Rhapsody, were some of the most disturbing and difficult to ignore. Rumors about Singer's behavior had been circulating for years, but like many others, he had been able to evade justice. Singer had long been accused of sexually exploiting underage boys, using his power to lure them into situations where they were vulnerable and easy to manipulate. It wasn't just about the abuse itself. It was about a systematic Hollywood sex ring that targeted vulnerable young men, often drugging them before taking advantage of them. These allegations had been buried for years, with some victims silenced by settlements and non-disclosure agreements. But once Weinstein's empire began to crumble, the floodgates opened for Singer's victims as well. Lawsuits piled up, and more survivors came forward, sharing harrowing accounts of abuse and manipulation. However, instead of facing the consequences of his actions, Singer fled to Europe, escaping the scrutiny and remaining largely out of sight. His involvement in the abuse of young boys was now an undeniable part of Hollywood's dark history, and his career would never recover. As Weinstein's empire collapsed, Jeffrey Epstein's name resurfaced like a nightmare from the depths of Hollywood's darkest secrets. Epstein, the financier who was arrested for running a global sex trafficking ring involving underage girls, had long been a figure of mystery and fear in elite circles. His connections to powerful figures in politics, business, and Hollywood had always been whispered about. But now, those whispers were turning into full-fledged accusations. Epstein had been known for hosting lavish parties at his private island, Little St. James, where the rich and famous would gather to indulge in their most sordid desires. As the truth began to surface, flight logs from Epstein's infamous jet revealed a chilling list of names, many of whom were A-list celebrities. Actors, directors, producers, people who had stood at the pinnacle of Hollywood were now connected to one of the most grotesque criminal enterprises in modern history. Weinstein's ties to Epstein also came under scrutiny. The two men had shared similar habits, and it was clear that Epstein's private parties had been a haven for Hollywood's powerful abusers. Names continued to surface, and the entire industry seemed to be on the verge of an existential crisis. No one was safe anymore, not even the untouchable stars who had used their wealth and influence to avoid accountability. As more names emerged, panic spread through Hollywood. Agents, producers, and executives scrambled to delete emails, scrub their social media profiles, and sever ties with anyone remotely connected to Weinstein or other abusers. The industry's underbelly had been exposed, and no one knew who would be next. At a high-profile Hollywood party, one actor was overheard muttering, "Who else is next?" The fear was palpable. The monsters had been revealed, and Hollywood's carefully curated image was beginning to fall apart. There were whispers about even bigger names, about the next wave of accusations that might bring down other powerful figures. The fear was no longer a secret. It was the undercurrent to every conversation. The final image of this chaotic time is etched in history. Harvey Weinstein, once the king of Hollywood, now walked into a courtroom, his hands shackled, his career in ruins, as reporters shouted his name. The man who had manipulated, abused, and destroyed lives was now facing the consequences of his actions. But the real question remained: how many more men like him were hiding in the shadows, waiting for their turn to be exposed?